Who would you say is your sort of prime audience, if you could even think of it in those terms?
Younger people who don't read much anymore, and
Hmm.
because I've put it online on YouTube, may stumble across one of Ernie, my producer's clips that will bring them into the larger framework. And who knows, one or two of them may actually buy the book and read it and find your footnotes that refer to your books in it and so forth. But I honestly am trying to do something, and trying is the operative word here. I put the whole thing online for free starting November 1st. I'm hoping to reach a younger generation of people who don't seem to be able to put together very basic things that I have taken for granted
Hmm.
as someone from another generation. Relationships, dating, marriage, having children, things that were no brainers for millennia, even in times of crisis. And I'm going to introduce you and then hand this whole thing over to you. Hey, my name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Professor Christian Smith. And Christian Smith is the William Kennan Jr. Professor of Sociology and founding director of the Center for Study of Religion and Society at Notre Dame University. He's well known for his research focused on religion, adolescents, and emerging adults and social theory. He is the author of Why Religion Went Obsolete, The Demise of Traditional Faith in America. And he's also the author of another book that's meant a lot to me that we'll talk about a little today in the context of this interview with me about my book, The Gospel of Zip, and that is Moral Believing Animals, which I quote in my book. So, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer is a production that Ernie Gregg, my producer, makes happen. And I'm asking you to please subscribe right now on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary page. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And also to go to thegospelofzip.com, which is where you will get all the information about this book we're talking about today. So this is an unusual interview in that last time I had Christian Smith on, I was interviewing him about why religion went obsolete and talking to him about his own journey as an author and professor and spiritual leader, really in his um, world, which is university and teaching and professorship and authorship. And I think Christian's the author of more than 20 books. I was trying to look them all up today to remember what they all were. Um, but he also is someone who contributed heavily to my new book, The Gospel of Zip. And that's right here, a canine human love story exploring why most dogs and a few humans live joyful lives. And it will be out November 1. So basically, as we speak, it's coming out. Before I get into answering Christian's questions, I just want to mention that I've done something I've never done with any books of mine in the 40 years that I've written books and made a living from it. And that is that I've offered the Gospel of Zip in its entirety for free on YouTube, filmed by one of the former producers of the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour on PBS, who also produced some of the Nova shows, who is a friend of a friend, and camped out in my living room for a week, turned it into a set, filmed every single chapter or section of the book, edited it together, gave it to Ernie Gregg, who's putting it online for free, no strings attached, no fundraising, no gimmicks. In addition to which, it will be for sale on Amazon and also in its Kindle version. So this is unusual for me, Christian, because I've never given away a new book for nothing. But I also feel that since I've written the Gospel of Zip trying to reach people, some of whom, many of whom do not read anymore, they're not really illiterate, but it's a whole generational thing. Two things I'll mention up front, and then I'll turn it over to you. First of all, this book is in very short sections that almost read like texts or phone messages rather than big long chapters. They're about 30 seconds to a couple minutes each. And then the second thing is because it's online on YouTube, it's in the medium that people actually watch. A lot more people watch me on YouTube in my commentaries than read all my books put together at any given day, even though some of my books have done quite well. So anyway, that's a weird long introduction. And I just want to thank you so much, Christian, for being willing to do this, because having interviewed you about why religion went obsolete, and having seen in your book passages about some of my journey and directly talking about my father, Francis Schaeffer, and so on, it strikes me that if there's anybody out there that quote unquote gets this book, um, it will be you, because you've been writing about very similar things for years and years and years, and you come at it from a perspective that I value incredibly. And I'm just honored to have you talking to me today. So thank you so much for interviewing me about my own book, The Gospel of Zep. Period. That's it.
Well, you're welcome. And first of all, congratulations on the book. I
Thank
know
you.
writing books is a big project, and it's a major accomplishment when they finally come out. So congratulations to you for that, and
Thank you.
to Zip for his moment in the spotlight, or maybe decade in the spotlight. We'll
Yeah.
see,
Yeah.
and etc. But yeah, the amazing thing is, my own dog right now is insisting, of course, right now at this second, that he be let inside. So my
Go
dog,
get your dog. I mean,
anything.
we can't have a book about Zip and
But yeah,
not do what our dogs
let me
want.
ask you my first question, and you can get started answering. I'll be right back after I let him in. But
Yeah.
first, I mean, the Gospel of Zip is not your average book title. So first, why don't you just can you provide us a general orientation? What is this book basically about? Like, what
Sure.
kind of genre is it? And
Yeah.
what's your story in it? And I'll be right back.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the what the Gospel of Zip is actually about is what my friend Christian is doing right now, going out and letting his dog in. I have a passage in the book about Zip saying that I describe him as a person, and I after that I say, "Hey, you read that right." And what I mean by that is that this companionship and this kind of symbiotic relationship we have with our dogs goes far past any relationship we have with most other animals. There, for instance, right here, we have one. And Zip is lying next to my wood stove, by the way. He's found the heated spot in the kitchen, which we will occupy for the rest of the winter. Um, but what this book is actually about is the fact that as we look at evolution, as we look at creation, as we look at the world we're in, we have a choice to make. And that is really, it's between two philosophies, which also are kind of scientific theories. And that is the survival of the fittest, in which the most brutal and the most dominant always wins, bullies win, and the survival of the friendliest, which comes out of a book on canine behavior that was written by two people who at Duke University at the Canine Study Center study dogs. Brian Hare is someone who does this, and Vanessa Woods is his wife and his writing partner. And I came to their writing while trying to understand why I loved Zip so much and why he loved me. And I began to just read stuff on dogs. And that was a rabbit hole I went down. Jessica Pierce, who's a bioethicist, and others that I got in touch with started recommending books that I read. And at the end of about a 2-3 year period of reading and studying, as a layperson in this field, but getting very, very interested, I discovered a pattern, and this will be odd to a lot of people who listen to me, but that actually the message of the dogs in my life, and Zip in particular, corresponded very closely to the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. Um, and the ideas, the essential basic ideas of the moral philosophy of Christianity. And I don't think that's coincidental. I'm not making an argument for becoming a Christian or being one, but out of my evangelical background, it struck me very forcefully that this kind of humility, forgiveness, love, companionship, friendliness, second, third, fourth chances when you screw up, that dogs give people that they're close to, is really sends us a message from nature that you find reflected in some of the histories of hunter-gatherer groups, for instance, of community, togetherness, care, responsibility. You are your neighbor's keeper, and so forth. And so basically, the Gospel of Zip is a book that explains, as best as I can, a couple of things that actually have a lot to do with each other. What do I learn from the dogs that are part of my life about behavior towards dogs, but also toward humans? How does my journey toward understanding Zip's selflessness and kindness actually inform what I've learned in 56 years of marriage to Jeannie, who I got pregnant when we were 17 and 18, and we've been together ever since, 3 grown children, 5 grandchildren. And I guess what I found is a similarity in the lessons that I've learned about life and my own spiritual trajectory, what dogs teach us in the way they behave toward humans, and what we can all take away from this message in terms of the choices we make of how we treat other people and what's important in our lives. So to me, it really is the gospel of Zip. He kind of preaches through his actions, which all good spiritual leaders do. They don't talk as much as they behave in a way that you can imitate and live better. And I just find that what I've learned by becoming close to this one dog actually sheds light on far larger questions about human behavior and culture. So that's a long-winded answer, but it's one that I find also reflected in books of yours that I've read, like most particularly Moral Believing Animals, which talks about, very similar things that you have discovered in terms of basic teachings of Christianity. So, my book is kind of related to yours. In fact, I quote Moral Believing Animals in part of my book, both directly and just footnoted, because what I've learned from Zip is sort of what you've learned from the universe in a way, if I can put it that way. And it, we're on a similar path. So it's kind of an odd way to put it, but that's it. That's my explanation.
Yeah, cool. So thank you. And so what's clear in all that is this book is not sort of a didactic theoretical treatise. It's also not strictly autobiographical, but it weaves together a certain autobiographical sensibility or genre
Yeah.
with other learnings about dogs that you've talked about. It's kind of spiritual reflect. So it's not easy to position it in a genre, but would you who would you say is your sort of prime audience, if you could even think of it in those terms, for this
Yeah.
book? Would you most love to see reading this book?
Younger people who don't read much anymore, and
Hmm.
because I've put it online on YouTube, may stumble across one of Ernie, my producer's clips that will bring them into the larger framework. And who knows, one or two of them may actually buy the book and read it and find your footnotes that refer to your books in it and so forth. But I honestly am trying to do something, and trying is the operative word here. I mean, this whole thing may just absolutely fall flat on its face and disappear. But I have gone a long way towards trying to change the way I write books, not so much the writing, but the way I've made it into sections, with two things: the way people read these days in terms of text length messages on phones, combine so all these short sections, 347 sections that are very, very short. I mean, the book is not that thick,
Hmm.
but it's divided into 347 sections. And I put the whole thing online for free starting November 1st. So really, it's not so much of who do I want to have read the book, who my audience is in terms of readers. I'm hoping to reach a younger generation of people who don't seem to be able to put together very basic things that I have taken for granted
Hmm.
as someone from another generation: relationships, dating, marriage, having children, things that were no-brainers for millennia, even in times of crisis. So the key here is trying to talk to people about what made my life joyful and what I learned from my failures in a way that points them to avoid some of the mistakes I made. And then at the same time says, look, Jeannie and I were pregnant as teenagers. It was far from ideal. It's been very difficult, but it's worth it, because at the end of the day, I'm writing to people who seem to be missing out on stuff that I take completely for granted. Like walking into a home where there's no books and no art on the walls, and
Hmm.
you start looking around thinking, what do the people who live here find beautiful? What gets them through the day? And so who I'm writing to is the people who are in danger of missing out on things that I have found to be all that. As an older person at 73, I look back over the course of my life, and there's a lot of nonsense and a lot of failure. But the areas that I kind of hold on to and that give my life meaning right now are things that I find many people seem to be ignoring or screwing up to a degree that is almost irreparable. And I think it's a kind of a tragedy. So I'm writing to people who don't read by putting it on YouTube. I'm writing to a reading public who perhaps hasn't seen a book exactly like this. Married couple who wants to stay married, a parent who looks around at our culture, putting a phone in the hands of their children and wonders if there's somebody out there who can show them a little bit of a better way in terms of childcare and these things. And then people looking at relationships as if they come ready-made. You find the one. And I'm saying, no, that one doesn't exist. It's a question of, will you work at this? Here's what happened with Jeannie and me. Here's how we did that. But it's a process. So it's a kind of an anti-instant solution book. It's an anti-materialistic consumerist book. It's an anti-career book, not in the sense that we don't all need jobs, but that's not at the end of the day what you're going to be hanging on to when you get to be my age. And it's a book about relationships. And that's, again, where Zip informs those, because Zip doesn't have to learn these lessons. My dog understands all these things. This is why the dog species has survived and become the most successful species of all the canine species, because they have managed to domesticate you and get you to go outside and get them when they need you. And you don't resent it because they repay in love. And that's actually the lesson of, what I've learned about marriage, life, children, all these other things. So, that's kind of how I've come to this. So it's for people who don't read. And hopefully they'll watch it and listen to it.
So what I hear you saying in a way is you grew up in a very different world of a certain generation, which I understand, and the world has changed a lot. And whatever good may have happened in those changes, you also observe that there are losses, that there are things that have been lost knowledge, lost values, lost commitments. And so you hope this book, and you're trying creatively to sort of present it in ways that make it more accessible, without dumbing it down. You hope this book was sort of like an intervention. So that sounds a little heavy-handed of a term, but sort of a breaking into some people's lives and saying, hey, pay attention to these things. Here are some values, here are some lessons, and so on. Does that fairly characterize?
Very much so. And not pointing to myself as the model to be imitated.
Yeah.
I point to Zip as the model to be imitated, but pointing to the fact that there were many instances in my life where I had really missed the boat. As I put it in one of the opening paragraphs, I say, listen, I was basically grew up in this Calvinist religious household where men were in charge of everything, and we were supposed to throw our weight around. And the way I term it is, I said, I was groomed to be an asshole by divine right. In other words, this is who you're meant to be. So it's a journey away from something that wasn't working for me to something that was working. And that doesn't mean everybody else's journey will mirror mine, but just to make the point that a life that feels worth living is a journey is already a point. It's not a series of markers of ambitions. You get this educational degree, you get this career, and then when everything's in place, maybe you dare to fall in love and have a relationship, more like mergers on a corporate level. And I'm saying, no, life is organic. And basically the lesson here is not how to live your life as if you've got to imitate me, but just get established in your head that this is a process that will include failure and that will include heartbreak and problems, but these are survivable as long as you have certain priorities. And those priorities are: together is good, alone is bad. We are social animals, behave like one. When you're staring at your phone, you're not in a relationship. That's a phone, not a person, and so forth and so on. And so, it seems very basic, but I've tried to do it by telling stories rather than simply holding forth the way I'm doing, say, a little bit in this interview. So this is a book by someone who has also written 4 or 5 novels, and there's as much storytelling in this book, not just about me, but also about the history of dogs and hunter-gatherer people and experiences I had, or my wife Jeannie, or when I was in South Africa directing movies and so on. But they all make a point. And the point is that at the end of the day, what was worthwhile was the relationships within those contexts, not what I was, quote, doing.
Yeah. So can you unpack a little bit more for me and for us, the ways in which this book is and isn't religious or spiritual or just life advice? Like I know about your father, your family's background. It was all part of my own background, and I have some sense of the journey you've been on. and you're not like a raving militant atheist, as I understand it, but you're still not, the Reformed Calvinists. Um, so, and I imagine, like, I haven't analyzed your followers, but I imagine that there are some people who are religious of different stripes and intensities, and some atheists, and some post-religious, and some spiritual but not
Yeah.
religious. Can you just sort of situate the book in that realm of concerns or identities? Like, how much are you engaging religious or spiritual issues, and how? Just so your audience sort of has a sense of that.
Well, I'll start with something that I actually footnote to you, and I didn't set you up to ask this question. And this is something that I've kind of paraphrased a little bit out of moral believing animals, and that is, I talk about being on Mount Athos in Greece with the monks there at Simonos Petra. And I talk about the fact that Father Basil, who was sort of the confessor who took me in a little bit while I visited, gave me several what he called heart rewiring tools, as he called them. And so I learned the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, end quote, added to the tools Dr. Schwartz had given me. And that was a therapist I was going to in terms of management and other problems I had. The repetition of the Jesus prayer became a way to step back from my quote moods and depression. I still pray this prayer many times a day. I still also hope that our life, and this is where I'm quoting you, and I footnoted it here, I still also hope that our life in the cosmos is significant, and that somewhere in the fabric of reality out there, someplace, there really is the story of which our many stories are but echoes. And by the way, that's one of my favorite sentences that's ever been written in the English language, and you wrote it. And I'm eternally grateful that I got to put it in my book, because as I was talking to Jeannie this morning, telling her that I was going to do this interview with you, I said, I don't want this to go by without me thanking Christian Smith again for writing that sentence. Because to me, you've captured my entire journey in that it's a mixture of belief, but that belief can also be mistaken as almost a psychiatric intervention on the part of a counselor. But where it gets really personal to me is this hope that somewhere out there, the story has been told or is available to someone somewhere. And that's kind of where I'm at. So I describe myself as an atheist who prays, and people say, well, then why do you pray if you're an atheist? And my answer, and I'm not trying to be a smartass here, is because my mother raised me that way. And I'm done trying to
The pray part, not the atheist part.
Not the atheist part, the prayer part. And I'm trying to figure out, where I begin and my background ends. And I used to try to parse the details of that, but now it's just, look, this is who you are. In other words, I'm also afraid of heights. I enjoy cooking. And there's all sorts of things about my personality that I can't explain as a belief. I didn't suddenly believe in cooking or believe in hiking or believe in snorkeling. I wasn't, this wasn't a moment of enlightenment. That's how I was raised. We went on vacation to Italy, and I used to snorkel in the Mediterranean as a child, and it was the golden part of my childhood. There weren't very many fish left. They'd overfished it. So it was like, a couple of fish here and there and a sea urchin or two, but it was golden to me. So why does that still, it's part of me. It's part of me. Well, I feel very much that way about what I just quoted from you. And that is that for me, it boils down to hoping that there is a story out there that is told somewhere that makes sense of all this. I don't have any particular intuition that I'm going to find that story in my short, tiny life that's running out very quickly. But nor have I abandoned the idea that it exists, and the very idea that there may be some sort of definitive answer out there as to what this is all about, to me is sort of enough of an answer for the time being. And in the meantime, in terms of getting through the day, when my Marine son was fighting in Afghanistan, I had no problem as someone not certain of what that story was to cry out and pray for his safe return. I didn't feel like I was being hypocritical at all. So, when you look at my past, I'm Francis Schaeffer's son, an evangelical theologian of some note, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, where am I at 73 years old? It's putting a priority in my life in terms of the relationships that matter to me, which revolve around childcare of my youngest grandchildren. It's putting a priority on relationships with people like you, whose work I appreciate, and drawing meaning from that, but not expecting anybody to show up with the answer. But I'm not just questioning for questioning's sake. In other words, to me, I've come to a place, and I know this sounds pretentious, but of sort of humble uncertainty. And when I look back on the hubris of my certainties, I regret them in the same way that I regret always having to be right when I used to argue with my wife. It's not that I've become wishy-washy, it's that I accommodate the idea that a lot of the time I'm wrong about stuff. And
Mm.
that's one of the pieces of my book.
Yeah, great. Thanks for unpacking that. So, it sounds like the book would be very accessible for a wide range of people in different places in their thinking and belief and so on.
Yeah.
Just back to the content, or what you want to convey from the book. So you've given us the big picture here. I oftentimes tell my students a good book has one overarching story
Mm.
and then three sub stories that
Yeah.
connect to the overarching story, but they're not just a repetition of it. So you've given us the overarching story. Are there any sort of sub stories here that you would highlight that sort of complexify the big picture?
Yeah. I mean, one of the sub stories is that if you find people to love in your life that you love more than you love your own opinions and are willing to change for them, you can find a certain grace and fulfillment in that. I guess bluntly, I would just say you don't always have to be right about everything. You can learn. So a subtext of this whole book, whether it's learning from Zip's behavior or my wife's patience or my failures, is that the less I think about myself as the most important character in my own story, the better off I am. I don't this sound that sounds odd, but one of the things I've done in the book as a subtext, if you look at it, is that I do tell a bit of my own story, and I set it up at the beginning. I'm Francis Schaeffer's son, and here's what happened with my dad and me and Dr. Coop and the religious right and so forth. But having done that, the rest of the book quotes, if you looked at the number of lines in the book, more of it is quoting my wife and what she thinks than quoting me, or talking about who Zip is and how he teaches through behavior, or looking at the story of dogs' evolution and how they developed as a species because of their ability to cooperate. So, in a strange way, I do what I have to set the book up. And then to the best of my ability, one of the subtexts is I disappear. I know
Hmm.
that sounds odd for a
Yeah, yeah.
memoir, but
No,
I
I mean
step
the
aside. I try to get out of the way of what really has influenced me.
Yeah, so that kind of embodies the humility that in a different way than just saying, "Hey, we should be more humble."
Right.
It kind of enacts a humility that you've learned in life. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I've actually been watching some YouTubes lately of some very successful people,
Mm.
leaders, financially successful, and one of the themes that comes out is, from what they have to say, is they embrace their failures as much as their successes because they learned something from them.
Yeah.
Like, and you
Yeah.
can't run away from one's failures. Um, and when I've interviewed hundreds, maybe thousands of people in the US, and one of the things that younger people have repeated is, I don't regret anything in my life because it's made
Mm.
me who I am.
Mm.
I guess that's better than living a life of profound regret, but it seems to presuppose that who they are is exactly what they should be or should
Yeah.
have become, and that there's nothing to regret.
Yeah.
Whereas there's a difference between that and when I hear leaders saying, I was stupid, like I made mistake, like I blew
Yeah.
it, and I had to learn from. There's a difference between saying I learned from my failures and
Mm.
I don't regret anything because it's who I am, and
Yeah.
who I am implicitly is just great.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so there's different ways to parse out this humility and learning from, not being right all the time, it seems.
Yeah. And I think one of the diseases of our age is this idea that, you don't ever express regret because somehow you lose face. That is such a ridiculous idea to anyone who's ever taken care of children, for instance. One of the things I do in my book, I mean, the Gospel of Zip, I point to two mentors of mine who had very imperfect lives, John Sandry and Priska, my sister, who he married, and talk about some of their struggles. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to reflect on is the fact that what I brought to the table finally as a parent was having learned from them what worked well for children rather than saying, I came up with this. So what I try to do is point toward people who have taught me something, not here's how I did it and I was right. And the idea about not having any regrets, would be the opposite of my entire book.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
basically, what my book says is here is a chronicle. You were talking about subtext. Well, one of my subtexts is a chronicle of failure and regret
Mm.
without any, like, there's no other part to this. It's not, I don't have regret. It's a chronicle of failure and regret
Hmm. Hmm.
of things that cannot be taken back or fixed again. But finding people who around me in relationships have forgiven me.
Mm.
And, if there's one lesson, and I'm not being maudlin here, but if I've learned something, the most, the two most powerful sentences, and I don't make a point of this in the book, but I'm just summing it up for you. The two most powerful sentences, I think, in the English language are one, please forgive me. And the second most powerful sentence in the English language is I forgive you. And basically, you don't say, please forgive me if you have no regrets. And
Yeah.
you think you are fine as you are. So I have brought with me out of my Calvinist background the idea that all have sinned and all are fallen short of the glory of God, which is a religious way of saying we are imperfect beings, and only a fool is satisfied with the way they are, because that
Yeah.
means there will be no further growth.
Yeah. Yeah. There are
And the
different
key,
ways. There are different ways that people take Calvinism. I mean, one is this super self-assurance.
yeah,
There's a quote. There's a quote in in one of Nick Wolterstorff's books. I can't remember it exactly, but it's he's quoting somebody else and who says, "I would rather face an entire army of angry infidels than one Calvinist who's sure that he's right."
yeah,
That's one way
yeah,
to take Calvinism. You know the truth. Everyone
yeah,
else get out of the way.
yeah,
Another is if God is sovereign and I'm just this little pipsqueak of a bundle of neurons inside my skull, like it all doesn't depend upon me. Like even if
right,
I can't figure it out,
yeah,
a sovereign God is the one who will sort this all out. And I
yeah.
don't have to worry so much about it. So, yeah, I just find the Calvinist background we both share kind of an interesting, it can go in lots of directions.
It can. And, one of them happened in Holland. There's a new book on Vermeer out by someone who wrote an incredible book about Caravaggio that Jeannie and I read a couple of years ago. And I was listening to a podcast with him the other day. In fact, Ernie's trying to book him on ours, but and this book's only come out like 3 days ago about, Vermeer, but that Vermeer's paintings, except for two of them, were all collected in one household up the street from him. And basically, this was a place of former Calvinists who had embraced a doctrine of acceptance of other people. And to understand his paintings, you have to understand that they were in the milieu of something going on in Holland at that time in reaction to 80 years of war with the Spaniards. And it was a group of Calvinists saying, maybe being sure you're right all the time isn't such a great thing. And it certainly hasn't worked out for us too well, has it? So,
No.
they're looking at an 80-year war of incredible bloodshed and whole towns being slaughtered and so on. And they're saying, hey, this has to stop. You can't be that sure you're right all the time, whether you're a Calvinist or whatever. And in a way, I bring a little bit of that history with me into my book because when my dad and I were kind of operating in the 1970s and 80s, we were very sure we were right about everything, or at least we pretended so. But at the same time, and I'm honest with people about this in the book, there was a kind of a lie involved in that, which really is painful for me to bring up, but I do. And that is that, my parents, who were these evangelical leaders, my mother was writing books about what is a family and all this other stuff, how to be an evangelical mother and a parent, but at the same time had put the ministry in her life so far ahead of raising her own children that, when I stumbled into a boarding school at age 10, I could barely read.
Mm.
Now I'm dyslexic, but her idea of homeschooling was to have one of the student helpers go teach Frank something, when I'm busy teaching a Bible study. And then on the other hand, my father was someone who was physically abusive to my mother and at the same time, was being hailed as one of these great Christian leaders. Now, there's nothing unusual in that story. If you talk to most people, whether it's Billy Graham's children, who I happen to have good friendships with a couple of them, like Gigi Graham, I'm not saying it was the same level of neglect or abuse, but as you and I know, because we're familiar with all of this, we're all very human people. The difference is, when you put an image out there pretending that you are something you are not, then those children grow up torn between the hypocrisy of keeping silent and the sort of need of the ministry. And that was my background. And it's something I address very briefly in the book in the context of explaining the kind of world I came from and how
Yeah.
I tried to grow beyond that in
Yeah.
terms of my own relationship with my wife and my children. And it's part of my story, and it's part of a lot of people's stories, unfortunately, who come out of those strict
Yeah.
Calvinist religious backgrounds. It's part
So
of the
you were
bag.
sort of blessed to be the preacher's kids on steroids
Yeah,
multiplied by, 20,000.
yeah,
And back to your two best or most important sentences in the English language. So, I mean, not to get too personal or too psychological about
yeah,
this, but presumably in your story, you've had to sort of forgive your parents in some ways, even
yeah,
whether or not they even asked for it. It's
yeah.
coming to terms with those kind of resolutions and acceptance of people's limitations in humanity.
Absolutely. And in a way, the book, you were talking about subtext. I guess the third subtext, if I've kept track right, we've done two, would be basically a book that is written not just about my failings, but a plea for forgiveness from my own family, in the sense of my wife on the gurney having just had a procedure to put a stent in after a heart attack, telling me she'd had a great life. And in the book, I talk about the fact that I took this as her saying, "I forgive you," because wasn't always so great. And basically, trying to have the grace in looking at things, like talking about my mother toward the end of the book, saying, look, by the light she was given, she did the best she could. On the other hand, from my point of view today, she wasted her life in that it was pursuing an idea of mission and salvation that, from my point of view, doesn't make sense, because these people were not lost in the way she meant it. Having said that, I talk about this kind of series that came out on TV in the 90s and ran for 9 seasons, called Touched by an Angel, that was very successful with sort of white evangelical types who the reason it lasted 9 seasons is they kept insisting that CBS not cancel it. And I say, it brings a tear to my eye, because the fact of the matter is, it's like going to one of my mother's Bible studies. This is what she believed. And I always feel like saying, "Hi, Mom." Not I'm not angry, but like, this is the world I was raised in. And then I challenge my secular, more liberal friends, and I say, after all, though, wouldn't you rather live in this world based on decency, forgiveness, charity, compassion, this idea that people can be saved and so forth, or the hard, cold truth of the world we're in? I have brought some of that baggage with me, and I'm not pushing back against all of it. I'm grateful for big chunks of it. But having said that, I'm done covering for it, because I can't.
Mm,
My father and my mother played world historical roles. Trump is not in the White House without some of the work Dad and Dr. Siever
mm,
Coop, and to my part, I did.
mm.
You can't walk away from a big historical event that your family had something to do with and pretend that everything was okay, because it wasn't. And some of the
Yeah.
hypocrisies that I talk about a little bit in my book are highly relevant, because they're the same hypocrisies that dog our moment now, when we pretend that, somehow God has brought us this person to lead our country at this moment, as if that's the whole story. Well, it's not. And the truth has to be told about these things. So that's not what the book is about. It's a canine human love story exploring why most dogs and a few humans live joyful lives. That said, the human writing this book comes from an incredibly flawed and hypocritical background, some of which I've entered into myself. And I actually make an apology at some point for my participation in that. But that said, my father was not this isn't revealing something about a private person.
Yeah.
He was a public person making
Yeah.
a public stand,
Hmm.
and there's no way to duck that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this seems to raise so many complex issues of, on the one hand, what we're saying here, or what sort of the implication is arrogance, certainty, knowing better than everyone else,
Right.
overconfidence. That's all a huge problem.
Yeah.
But uh, all the answer is not just, oh, I give up. I don't really know anything. I mean, humility presumably isn't just like, I've got nothing to say to anyone. I mean, you're still
Right.
producing. You're still
I
like this book is offering things to people. I hear what you're saying is the style of writing, the format of writing, the film version of it, etc., is itself trying to embody something different than I'm going to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
But and this isn't even a question, it's just an observation, trying to find the middle ground of communicating wisdom or insight or maybe truth without turning it into, I know the truth and you better follow or
Yeah.
listen. That's a real challenge, I think, especially in the world today that's very polarized, that's very divided, where people are gaining power and making money off of dividing and conquering.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me it's a real challenge.
Yeah, and it is. And this book is coming out on YouTube for free, but it's coming out in a medium, a sort of a what's happening now medium that everybody goes to online, that half the time is being run by billionaires who are setting it up with algorithms that direct
Yeah,
you towards something that'll keep you angry.
yeah.
And I'm saying take a deep breath, step back, stop going to the clickbait. Give me 7 hours and 15 minutes, which is what it takes to watch this book in entirety or some part of it or read it or whatever. But at the end of the day, you'll walk away. I hope my reader, my listener, my viewer will walk away saying, it's time to get past our divisions and listen to some of the stories in this book, which, for instance, involve the Trump voters who live down the street from me. I talk about, they put a Trump sign in their yard, but I still helped my neighbor Jay put up his Christmas tree lights that year because he's my neighbor. And that, again, is a Zip lesson. Zip
Yeah.
wags his tail, greets you at my door, does not ask you who you voted for or condemn you for being a fascist or a communist or a hater or whatever. Zip's first reaction is, great, a human being. I love humans. Come on in. Let me see who. It sounds kind of idealistic, but really the gospel of Zip is an appeal to people to begin to follow some of the basic human survival instincts of hunter gatherers, which say, listen, like it or not, we depend on each other. And we need each other. And we need each other whether we voted for Trump or a MAGA voter or a conservative Republican or a liberal Jew. Doesn't matter. This is where we are. This is our
Mhm.
moment. What do we have in common? And then I start listing those things.
But
We fall in love.
is the driving sort of orientation evolutionary survival? Like what like you can root this in Darwinism if you want. That is, it's not all about the strongest survive.
Right.
What you started off saying is those who learn how to cooperate are the ones that survive, actually.
Yeah.
And
But
you
those
could
who
also
learn to,
root this, I think you mentioned this at the start of this cover, you could also root this in, the Sermon on the Mount or Jesus is
you
teaching,
can.
like, yeah, people are going to kill you. It's okay.
Yeah. I also feel, though, that when you look around at the people in your life who have affected you most, it's been the artists and the people who have pursued an idea that beauty itself has intrinsic worth. So that what you look at, what you read, what you see, what you do, we've forgotten that. We've forgotten that the intrinsic worth of beauty. The point of raising a child is to enjoy the child, not prepare them for a career. The intrinsic worth of the love you have is enough. The point of loving your wife and making love to her and learning to live with her is not because then fill in the blank. You can make more money. You can do this thing. You can do. And I think the great sorrow from that I'm trying to share with people and then point a way past, if I can say it boils
Mm,
down to one thing, is to re-identify the intrinsic worth of what makes life most worthwhile.
mm,
And it is not what our culture is telling you.
mm, mm.
You are being lied to.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate in my next question.
Yeah,
What if somebody heard this and said, well, that's just an old guy going soft? Like,
right.
reality is the strongest, the fittest will survive.
Mm,
And you and I have relatively nice lives, but that's
sure.
because, we've managed to be successful and we have money in the bank and we're protected by the US military. And there's a lot of bad actors in the world that want to
Yeah.
do terrible things to our country, to Western civilization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a privileged,
Mm,
protected position to point to Zip as Like this is a great
Sure.
model. If somebody took that attitude and say, well, it's good for you, but that's just because you're successful and
Mm.
you're being protected by people that have a more realistic view.
Yeah.
What would you say to them?
Well, on the protection side, and this is not an answer to you, one of them was my son who was in the Marine Corps fighting in Afghanistan twice and once in Iraq. And so I was not disconnected to the quote, people out there doing the hard lifting.
Mhm.
We had many a sleepless night waiting to get news that he had been killed. So I understand a little bit about the cost of being protected. But I would say you've got a good point. And I would look at them and say two things. First of all, that's the way it's always been. In other words, I understand privilege from the inside because, I have been privileged. I'm white. I'm upper middle class. I'm not educated, by the way. You're a university professor. My son John always joked whenever I'd go do a tour speaking at universities, Dad, when you're at fill in the blank, um, Princeton, whatever it may be, teaching a thing on, as part of a course on religious history, see if they'll give you an honorary high school diploma because I ran away from a British boarding school when I was 15. So the family joke is the least educated person in our family is the one that speaks most in universities, which you get because you probably invite crazy people too. But that said, I recognize that. And I would just simply say this, and that is that at the end of the day, the old guy going soft and saying, do what I do, and it worked out fine, and fall in love and have children and all the rest of it. The downside is that our culture is built in a way now that pushes against those most normal human attributes. It's hard to have a family, it's hard to settle down, it's hard to make a
Mhm.
living. But establishing the intrinsic worth of beauty when it comes to what our ultimate values are seems to me the only sane road back to something better. In other words, it's no use just stepping back and saying, um, I'm older, I've had some successes, or I'm more privileged, and therefore I can't speak on this, when the problems that I'm speaking to are not fundamentally rooted in class or race. They are rooted in the human condition when you forget the intrinsic worth of love, beauty, connection, sharing, forgiveness, charity, all these things. And so to me, whatever your condition is, you will be better off if you're living a merciful and forgiving life.
Yeah,
You will be
yeah,
better off if you're not alone. Loneliness is a killer. Evolution wants you dead if you're lonely. We know this. That's what Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, wrote about. So, basically stopping traffic for a minute and saying there's an accident up ahead. I'm directing you down this side road here to save your life. Doesn't matter if I'm black, white, female, male,
Mhm.
trans, or gay. The point is, am I telling the truth?
Mhm.
And I'm trying to help my reader, my listener, avoid a fatal traffic accident with
Yeah,
their entire lives by saying, every time I tried that, that's what almost destroyed me. Every
yeah,
time I tried that, and those were my priorities, it led to my life, the meaning in my life starting to evaporate. I'm trying to warn you off this path that everyone else is telling you to go down. And I'm saying that way lies madness. Take it or leave it. Um, that's it.
yeah.
That's my best shot.
So in a way, basically, what you're saying is, yeah, of course they're bad actors. Of course, life is complicated and there's power and all that. But
Yeah,
if we lose track of what is ultimately good and valuable and worthwhile and humane in life, then we're truly lost. Like
we're truly lost.
it's not just about all that, but there's got to be that as a North Star to constantly reorient our actions.
Yeah, and the thing is, having read a little bit and traveled a little bit and worked a little bit and written a little bit over the last 73 years, very actively so for 60 of them, you know, enumerating what you've learned at basically as your own life wraps up and passing that back is part of the caregiving process that I do with my grandchildren.
Yeah, yeah.
And to me, and I have this little story in the book, and it sounds very self-serving, and I apologize for coming over as this sort of smarmy know-it-all, but I'll just tell it to you. One of the little stories I talk about in my book, just saying, look, it was like winning a medal or the Nobel Peace Prize for me, was my granddaughter at age 17 I had been down to her high school. That's a 45-minute drive in each direction 3 times that day, once for her brother, once for her sister. And then I had to go back because she had a migraine headache and I was going to go pick her up. And when I got there, she got in the car and said to me, Ba, because she calls me Ba, not Grandpa, um, Mom said you might not come because you'd already been down to the school 3 times. That's 45 minutes in each direction, 3 times in a working day. And I looked at her and she sounded very teenagery and a little miffed. And she says, and I told Mom, I said, of course Ba will come. And to me, that was like winning a prize. In other words,
Mm,
that has nothing to do with being white and privileged. That
mm,
has to do with being the fail-safe backstop for an entire young life.
mhm,
Of
mhm.
course, Ba will come. And to
Yeah,
me, that prize that I won that afternoon, she didn't mean it as a compliment. She was just talking. But it was like, yeah, that's the thing right there. Of
yeah,
course,
yeah,
Ba will come. And if you're that person for enough people in your life, I don't mean to sound presumptuous, you will find joy. If you're not
yeah,
that
yeah,
person to anybody, you won't.
yeah.
So
So
it's not,
I,
hey, I'm always right. It's like there are some people in my life who count on me, and
yeah,
I try not to fail them. And that's what I've learned in 73 years. And I try not to fail my dog either, by the way. And in that, I'm imitating him. So I don't know if that resonates with anybody, but to me, that's the heart of my book.
yeah. So it sounds like what I'm hearing is a basic intention of this book, or the spirit of the book, is nurturing,
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
telling people the truth. And even as I reflect on my question about, needing protection and power and military and violence and all, I would say most of the good people in the military, they're not doing it because they want to dominate other people. They're doing
Right.
it because they think there's something good in the world that needs protecting.
Yeah.
So,
And that's certainly the ideal that runs through young men like my son, John, who volunteered right out of high school to serve in the U.S. Marine Corps. This was before 9/11. He wasn't volunteering for a war. Part of it was a youthful lark. He wanted some discipline. He wanted to do this and wanted to do that. But he grew up very quickly. And as I started getting letters back from boot camp, reflected in a book I wrote called Keeping Faith, a father son story about love in the United States Marine Corps, that he and I wrote together, that did quite well because it struck a note with people. The reason it did well was the fact that he transformed himself from this young guy who wanted a little bit of an adventure to someone who really had his fellow Marines back. And he was learning that. So what he did in boot camp, in a 3-month period, is basically what I learned that gets me to a point at age 70 plus with a granddaughter who says, of course, Bob will come. John didn't have to look around and figure out if the Marines near him in combat in Afghanistan had his back. He assumed it. Of course, they will come.
mm,
And basically, it's taken me a lifetime to learn that. And that's not based on class or race or ethnicity or age or anything else. That's just basically learning what life teaches us about the intrinsic worth of connection.
no.
And
Why
as
do
I
you think?
say, Zip can tell you that without having to write a book about it, just by the
Yeah,
way he
yeah,
acts
yeah,
when you come in the door.
yeah. So before our time runs out, I've got to ask a sociological question. I'm a sociologist.
Yeah.
But I'll preface it by observing, and this is not at all gotcha. I just think it's fascinatingly human.
Yeah.
Probably three things you've said in our discussion remind me a little bit of your dad.
Mhm.
Earlier, you said, some of the pathologies of our culture are.
Right.
That sounds very much like Francis Schaeffer to me.
Absolutely.
And so at some point you said, even though you come across with a spirit of humility and learning and all that, you
Yeah.
said something to the effect of, you need to something about the truth. Like we need to own up to the truth, or we need to
Sure.
realize the truth. So that's not just Francis Schaeffer. I mean, that's obviously broadly correct. Like we should be after the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, his story, after he turned away from his more philosophical mode into more political,
Yeah.
cultural critique mode, was that the problem was secularism.
Mhm.
I'd like to ask you, and this is my truly interested sociological, and you say young people don't read, which is true, etc. As an amateur sociologist, so to speak, what do you think is at the root, or what's driving some of our contemporary
Mm.
social, cultural, political problems that lead to less than fully human lives that people are working out now. Like, if it's not secular humanism, what is
Yeah.
it?
Well, dare I give
This is
any?
getting far away from your book, I realize,
No, it's not. It's cutting
but
right to the chase
I've got
here.
to ask this one.
I love it. Basically, I think that the root cause of some of the disconnection, whether it manifests in reading or anything else from what has gone before, is two things, in my view. Um, One is a general disillusionment with the direction of our culture from within and a loss of hope.
Hmm.
So why bother with anything less than the material? The other, of course, is a minor thing, but it plays a big part in people's life, and that is there is something new that you and me have lived long enough to know is new, and that is this generation that is so hooked on social media
Hmm.
is not experiencing something fundamentally unhuman or new, but the volume is so loud and the intensity is so great that it weans people away from a kind of a common shared human experience. In other words, I have more in common with hunter gatherers living in the Nainai and in the Kalahari Desert for the last 100,000 years that um, the old way, the book that I quote in my book, that's about them, I understand more of where they're coming from just because I have a garden and I spend time out there and I grew up in a peasant village in Switzerland and know how to slaughter a sheep or dress a pig, that's been butchered and so forth. There's a connection there. When you come to this point where you come to a generation that can't read a map because they're looking at a phone and it tells them what to do, there is a real divide there. And when you're going to algorithmic entertainment that's designed to trigger a response by very clever people who have manipulated you. It's not that something new has happened that I have no knowledge of, but it is a new day. So that sort of weaned people away from the traditional methods of receiving information and contemplating things. But I think the biggest thing is a loss of hope, and that's something I do try to address in the book. And that is that in the historical context of the human race, this is not the worst time to be a human. This is one of the best times to be a human. In the context of the human race, this is not the worst time to start a family. This is one of the best times, no matter how much it costs to have a child. It costs a lot less than it did when 80% of the women bearing children died in childbirth. It costs a lot less than that. Uh, so I think that the lack of knowledge when it comes to history and precedent, combined with this instant entertainment that basically consumes so many people, takes us away from a more contemplative way of looking at things and ourselves within that context. I think people really feel cut off and alone. And some of it is staring at their phone, but some of it is philosophical. So it's not so much secular humanism. I think it's another thing, and that is it's what I talked about a little earlier, and that is the loss of the sense of the intrinsic worth of what I'll call the nuts and bolts of life.
Hmm.
Love, care, companionship, being together. And when you let that stuff go, when it's about anything except those things, you can call it secular humanism or you can call it a loss of faith or whatever. And I think conversely, going to your book that you wrote, Why Religion Went Obsolete, if you look at why, and I would throw this question back to you, I think one of the big reasons is that religion went obsolete because people began to stop looking for ultimate answers there because they didn't
Hmm.
believe those answers existed, not so much because of secular humanism, but because of consumerism and capitalism, which basically wean you away from the commonality of the human experience:
Hmm.
love, connection, forgiveness, compassion. Those are the only reasons we're all still here and having this conversation. And I think everything in our culture has been designed, and when it comes to the tech brothers and the algorithms, deliberately designed to take us away from those common experiences. So, when I read about hunter gatherers, I have more in common with them than I do, say, in the world that someone like Elon Musk is trying to build or says he's
Yeah.
trying to build.
Yeah. So in a way, yeah, what I hear you saying is like what the left calls the 1% basically makes a lot of money and gets power off of exploiting the worst in other people
Yeah.
or dividing people or appealing to the worst tendencies in humanity, which to bring it back to Zip, a dog would never do that.
A dog would never do that. A dog would never legalize sports gambling. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not joking. A dog would never legalize weed when the THC factor is 50 times what it was back in the days when hippies would smoke a joint in my day.
Yeah.
A dog would never legalize child porn, being sold to us as sex education.
Yeah.
Because at some point you rip the fabric that the dog counts on when he comes to the door and scratches, and Christian Smith goes out and lets his dog in, or when Zip stares at me and I know he's shared my granola in the morning and now he wants this other meal he always eats in the middle of the morning.
Yeah.
We're tearing up the fabric of what makes us human. And basically, I don't have the answer for that, but I know one thing for sure, and that is that anybody who gives the Gospel of Zip some time will come away, if they get into it a little bit, with a completely different idea about what's most important in life. And it's
Yeah.
not something you're hearing in lots of other places.
Yeah.
Or it comes attached with a religious message, as in, if you don't join our group, you're lost. Or if you're
In
not part
some
of
sense,
what,
I hear you saying in a similar to your father, but in a very different mode than your
yeah,
father. Oh, we really need a countercultural movement that will challenge the dominant ideas and
yeah,
ideologies and forces of the day to
yeah.
be more to keep us grounded in what's human. And
Yeah,
I find it lovely that a dog is sort of the premier player in this story.
yeah, and I didn't do that just to be cute. I mean, it is a little bit counterintuitive, and it's like Queen Elizabeth saying in Shakespeare in Love, I think at one point she says, make sure you include the bit with the dog. She liked the bit with the dog in the Shakespeare play there. A bit with the dog never hurts anything, and we all love dogs. But that said, my bit with the dog is really part of where I live, in that part of understanding who we are as human beings and our connections that give us the most meaning in life is understanding that that is part of nature. When I say in my book, evolution wants you dead if you're alone, that's not an exaggeration. It's a mean way to put it, but it's the truth.
Mm.
Speaking of true things, evolution doesn't like people who are alone. That's not the way to survive. Dogs know this, and can show us the way. But the reason I've call it the Gospel of Zip and built this story around a dog, as well as my love for my wife and my children and grandchildren and all these other things, is that these aren't separate stories. The story of canine cooperation with humans is the same story of human cooperation with humans. And it's not a different story. So it's not exactly secular humanism, but all of nature brings us the same message.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to have revealed biblical truth to understand it, from my point of view. But where Christianity, and I talk about this in the book, in the light of Tom Holland's book Dominion and your books as well, where Christianity brings tremendous light to my life is in understanding the fact that certain truths don't depend on their religious nature. They are true in the ultimate sense of true, that they describe reality. And to me, that's what truth is. Truth is not a special faith. To me, true things describe actual reality.
Yeah.
And it seems to me the reality that we operate in is one of connection and these other things. And when you cut yourself off from that, the consequences are dire. And I think there's a whole generation that is being cut off from these things for algorithmic profit, because they're being sent down rabbit holes that make them more and more and more individual and alone instead of together. And, my book is basically really one thing. I'm just saying enough with seeing our country divided into MAGA on one hand and, good solid liberals on the other. We're all human first, and dogs know that. Why don't we?
Yeah. Well, listen, there's so much more here we could discuss. I have so many more questions, but I want to be respectful of the time frame of this discussion. So let me just wrap up by saying congratulations again on the book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad Zip is now much more famous than used to be,
Yep.
and I commend it all to your viewers and your readers. I hope it gets a good shake out in the world, and it sounds like it should really be a stimulant to some good critical but also constructive thinking. So thanks again, and
Thank you.
congratulations.
Thank you so much. And Christian, like I said it before, I really love your books, and I haven't read them all, but the two I have read, Why Religion Went Obsolete and Moral Believing Animals, really helped inform this book. So just for that, I thank you.
Sure. Oh, you're welcome. It's what I do in the world. So
Yeah. Hey, and you've done it well.
thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, good luck with all this, and fun talking to you.
Thank you. And do what you can to let people know about it, which you've already done here. But tell some of those people that you know who don't read that you interview, maybe they should take a look at this.
Sounds good. All
And
right.
unlike everybody else, and I'm not trying to sell them anything. It's free.
Yeah, gotcha. Cool. Sounds
No
great.
Bitcoins.
Thanks for being countercultural that way. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
All right.
Talk to you
Take care. Take care. Good luck.
Thank you, Christian. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.